Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I'm excited about the discussion that we're going to have here. I want to just introduce everyone. Luis Villa, hello, Luis. Sam Johnson and Amanda Brock. And, they're all very accomplished in open source and the field of AI. But I also want to find ways for you to be able to ask your questions. So I'll be turning it over to you in the audience here with questions that you might have. What I thought we would do is first just level set. How many people really have a clear idea of what it means by openness in AI? A little bit, right?
Well, you know what you think. Sam's putting his hand up.
Sam's putting his hand up. Okay, good. Well, we have the right person up here then. So that's where I wanted to start. And then I wanted to look at it from 3 different perspectives. And this takes from what we really focus on at the NewsTac. And I didn't introduce myself. I'm Alex Williams. I'm publisher of the NewsTac. And we're a technology publication for software engineers and developers. And we focus on explanation and analysis. That's kind of our focus. And what we like to do is look at it from the perspective of development, deployment, and management. And in many respects, we're trying to follow this, looking at the software development lifecycle in many respects. Now, the language has changed considerably with AI, and I think that's part of the complexity here. But you still need to be involved in those types of things. You still need AI engineers who can build out the models. You still need people to be able to, the people with the specialization in, for instance, in cloud services and deploying the models. You still need the ability to manage the models. And for me, I'm thinking about a lot about the correlation between openness and cost. And that's what we've seen a lot with DeepSeek, for instance. But I would love to just maybe, Sam, since you're the expert, talk about what does it mean to you? What is that meaningness of openness in AI?
Yeah, well, in the context of cost, it's really like a consumer surplus. It's transferring value from the vendor to the user. And if your definition for it is not painful for the vendor and helpful for the user to an extent, right? And this is why we have fair source and so on coming in between. But you do have to give up your pound of flesh, right, to enjoy the benefits of the branding that's well established over 25 years. But at the heart of it is reproducibility. So you need all of the software and non-software components to be able to reproduce the system.
Okay, the software, the non-software goes. Luis, how would you follow up on that?
I think that reproducibility part is one key aspect. I think part of what the traditional definition of open source was very focused for a variety of pretty good historical reasons on what developers need to get out of a pile of source code. And so we didn't talk about things like reproducibility. We didn't talk about things like transparency for governments. They just sort of ended up bundled together. And I think we're now at a moment where, for better or for worse, we need to start talking about reproducibility because that's part of what makes open so great for science.
Right, it's implicit, right, as well. And it's not bit-for-bit reproducibility, like same hash. It's just functionally equivalent, really.
Well, it depends on your use case, right? I mean, one of the things that was empowering about the OSI definition was that it gave the user that choice, right? You want to just get the same hash.
About OSI definition for software.
For traditional software. For traditional software.
The open source definition.
Yeah, the open source yeah. This is one of these things that is...
which is why we shouldn't add to, because it's very confusing.
Yes, stubbing our toe on open source and when there's not really source, I would say that is one of the confusing things about this current moment, right? The value, as you were saying, the value of the open source definition, the value of that brand has gotten so big that people need to use that brand even when there's not really source code in the traditional sense, or at least the source code is a very small part of that value. And I think that's part of what's confusing everybody right now.
Mm-hmm. Are you confused, Amanda?
Very.
So how are you trying to clarify?
Are any of us not confused?
Yeah, I'm always confused. So what's confusing you?
What's confusing me? Lots of different things, Alex. So for me, open source, and is about the source code, right? That's why we use source, because we're talking about the human readable source code. And I think the word source has been used in open source when we talk about things like intelligence in a different way. And everybody's mixing all of this stuff up and nobody knows what we're talking about, frankly. You can sit and have a very informed conversation with a very knowledgeable person and be in complete cross purposes because of your use of language, right? And we're never going to be able to force everybody to use the words we want them to use. So I think we sort of have to think about this in a big picture way. And I think we're doing something where we are looking at the beginning. I know AI has been around for a long time, but in many ways we're looking at the beginning of something, right? It's a start point. So when I look around the room, some of you are as old as I am, and you will remember the dot-com boom. And I was a lawyer in the dot-com boom. I was one of the first internet lawyers in the UK. And I spent quite a lot of my time doing these linking agreements. So every website that wanted to connect to another website would contract with it. I even wrote a book chapter about them.
So you'd have to form like contracts? to
Yeah,
link?
several pages. Wow, right? It's unimaginable, and you couldn't have it today, and you couldn't have the internet with that happening.
I actually saw one today. These
No.
dinosaurs still live.
Be very careful, I'm not that old.
I
So when you look at that, I use this example quite a lot with people who are getting into AI because frankly, it's so preposterous, right? But that's what we're trying to do now. We're trying to fit the old world into a new moment. And with that learning from my experience, I'm very focused on the fact that we should not try and define AI. What we should look at is that AI is kind of a sector, and LLMs and things, they're all going to evolve. So what we see in 3 or 5 years are not going to be what we see today. There's just no doubting that. So let's understand what the bits that make it up are. And there is an element of source code in there, and that should be described as open source. And if you can get away with calling a weight open source and it meets that definition, and we see MIT being used on DeepSeek, fair enough. But then you've got data. Now, I've heard some really concerning things recently where people are talking about data being distributed in open source software licenses. That should never happen because data's got a whole different set of rights. It should be licensed, and the people we should be bringing into this conversation who haven't been in the middle of it are all the data experts, and we have shitloads of those in the UK. That's
Yeah.
a technical term in data. But
Well,
you want to look at all those components, and you want to see open, partially open, closed.
You see it very clearly in the Kubernetes community where it's been all about software and code, until about a year ago, and suddenly data, started to have some recognition, but it still doesn't really. I don't think people really understand the data part of it. But I wanted to see.
well, and the data, if I can jump in, the data communities are really struggling with the other side of it, right?
Yeah.
Because we are so I am on the board of Creative Commons, where obviously we care a lot about content and culture, and I'm also on the board of a group that does open water data. And they brought me onto the board because they were like, well, we do open. We don't exactly know what open is, so let's get Lewis on, right? And that's in many ways, the data industry is, I would say, 15 years behind, like not in a bad way, not because of neglect, but they just don't, their understanding and their sophistication around openness in data is still very nascent, right?
Yeah.
This is a very new concept to them in a lot of ways.
I think there's a really interesting thing that I've just realised while you spoke. So at the back of the room, we have the original executive director of the Open Data Institute. In the middle of the room, we've got a leader from Open Data in Scotland. And in front of him, we've got one of my board members who was in the Cabinet Office until not long ago doing open data. The UK has been at the epicentre of data and openness, but we've lacked what you've got, which is the Bay Area. So we've not really brought these people into it. And I think it's super important that we start to bring this data conversation with these deep data experts. They're all nodding.
Yeah, we can bring extra seats up here.
Yeah.
I mean,
Well, actually, I would love to, if anyone in the back of the room has a perspective
Gavin.
that you'd like to share.
Have you earned your hoodie?
Or a question that you'd like to ask, this group, because I'm sure you're curious from their perspectives based on the context you have.
Thank you. Hello. It's good to be here, and I think you're spot on. Gavin Starks from currently run Icebreaker One, which is a non-profit focused on data governance. and how do we enable data sharing. And I completely agree that we've had decades of development of open source with various different license conditions. We've had Creative Commons, which has been applied to data, but I would absolutely echo, nobody knows what that means. Yeah. And I think there's this material difference as well between, it's like a category difference. Software is like this sort of mechanics, and people don't know how to license that. There's licensing models and this whole business model of ecosystem around that. Data is kind of used for lots of things in lots of different ways. It's used to shape marketing campaigns, maybe used to shape elections, is packaged up, sold, there's different rights around it and so on. And in the UK, we're creating a new bit of primary legislation called the Data Use and Access Bill, which is going to enshrine some of the principles of open banking into our ecosystem so that the customer is in control of their own data. So we're quite far ahead. In the EU, you've got an interoperability bill, you've got a data bill. So Europe, I think, is streets ahead of the US on this in terms of joined up thinking. But I think there's also a natural tendency to say, oh, well, it's data, therefore it's technology, rather than data.
I'd like to get Sam's perspective, because he hasn't had
Yeah.
much chance.
We heard this morning, I think was it Dan from Tesla, who said that we may need new licenses for this. And the way that I explain it is the data, which for a model kind of looks like a very, very, very large spreadsheet, is kind of animated by the code. And the code doesn't really do anything differentiated, right? You can have a model for medical and for other detecting faces at a secure facility, and they use the same code. The code's basically just like read line, printf, and kind of animates the data and makes it behave like software. And so Simon Wardley was here earlier. We were talking about how the data forms these symbolic instructions that map from an input to an output. And if you want to change the output for a given input, then you need to change the data. And so we kind of need, I guess, both groups, software and data people in the room, because most of the concerns around data is kind of this, static thing. But then when it's animated by the code, it looks more like software.
Anyone have a question that they'd like to ask quickly? And then I'll admit, yeah. The red. Yeah.
Hi, Terence Eden. One of the things that I think is interesting, we keep saying data, but there are lots of different types of data. So if something is trained on copyrighted material, let's say acquired legally, you might not have the rights to release that data, which means, do you have open source AI? Because you can't share that data. If you've got medical data, lots of people are very happy to share their medical data in the sense that, well, I'll be a statistical vector in the database over there, but they don't want the raw data that they were trained on to be out there as open. But equally, if it's Creative Commons, then yes, I do want my stuff out there. So when we say data, we can't just assume that everything is like water data and it's like, the valve being open or closed. But there are some things where you might say it's actually, I suppose I'm saying, can you make a case that you can have open AI with a data set that is closed for privacy reasons, for example?
I don't think so for two reasons. One, not everything has to be open source, okay? And some things shouldn't be. But we know, and I'll cover this in my talk later, but we know that these LLMs exhibit memorization. So they can, anything they've seen in training, right, can be recalled with sometimes photographic precision at runtime, at inference time, just as part of normal operation, and without even having to torture it. But if you really want to go and drill in and try and get around guardrails and things, you can often extract training data.
Yeah, and I think I'd add to that I think I mentioned this yesterday in one of the other panels I was on, where we were very blessed in open source that we had copyright as essentially a legal platform, a legal API that's reasonably consistent globally, right? And some of these things that, it's not just that people don't want their health data, it's that in reasonable countries, it's actually illegal to share that, right? Even the US actually gets that one right. And one of the things where I think the open source initiative's AI definition got a little tangled up in a way that I think is understandable, but unfortunate, is there was this question of, well, some data sets are literally illegal to share, should we still be able to make a model based on it that's, and I think, for good reasons that we can go into later if we really need to, OSI had to get that definition out. I have some sympathy for that. But at the same time, there's so much we still don't know about differing national regimes, differing technical capacities to get some of that regurgitation out of the models, things like that, right? It's all very much up in the air.
So I think I've got a slightly different approach, and I've had this since the first day the second definition from the OSI was mentioned to me. And I think it's the wrong focus. And I think the right focus is to come back to data. And I know some people in the room call it information rather than data. And to look at the different inputs that go into an AI as those evolve over time. And for me, those are going to be numeric, they're going to be words, they're going to be images, they're going to be sounds. So you've got what is it, what rights are in that? And you're looking at copyright, intellectual properties. You're looking at contractual rights, things like confidentiality. You're looking at individuals' rights to privacy. You're going to look at a range of rights that are being utilized by the AI, and then you're going to look at the use cases and the way in which those rights are being used. And when we get back to training, I think there's two things. There is the publicly available data, and then there's the data that you choose to share. So at least one of the big techs that I'm aware of that has an LLM won't have anything from its own company used to train its AI, right? And that's a standard policy in the company. Because what you've got is publicly available data in which these rights exist, and somebody may have something online that they shouldn't have put online that's now being used in training. So I'm not meant to tell you this, but within Open UK I might as well now, because at the weekend we're hoping to bring some people together in Paris at the AI Action Summit, and we're hoping to start this conversation with some of the groups of data experts who are going to be there, and then bring it back to the UK and look at what are you already working on? Because most people have jumped in and drilled down into a specific challenge like privacy, rather than looking at what are the rights and the information we're talking about, how are they being used, how is that technology working with them, and what we're hoping is to be a convening point in this conversation about the data.
Well, if I could just elaborate on that real quick, I think to the point earlier from a gentleman originally from the ODI,
Gavin.
Governance is in a lot of cases a much better word than licensing. Because I think this is one of these unfortunate things that open source is going to have to unlearn a little bit, right? Mm-hmm. Where we're just like, the answer is always a license, and licenses have certain properties that just don't apply to some of these kinds of things that you're talking about, Amanda. And I think we're all going to have to get a little more flexible about that than we have been in the past.
But I want to ask Sam a question. I know you're going to say something, but it seems like without the openness, the work will continue to be done in the castle. You'll still have the very rich few being able to develop this software, and developing the data to go with the software, right? And it seems like that seems to me like a big question about the openness. Can that openness change that? Can it bring it out of the castle to some extent? I talked to some front-end developers who are very frustrated, because they just can't afford to do this kind of work.
Yeah, what I was going to say was that when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? And that's been a constant problem for open source. And I'm going to talk more about the what, but if we look at the why, and actually the cost of training is one of the regular things that gets trotted out, particularly by the OSI. It's too expensive. It's like in the 80s when it's like nobody can afford this. There's a worldwide market for 5 computers, right? Nobody can afford to have one, so we don't need open source, right? And we're hearing all of that nonsense again. But if we don't do this, right? So what's good is if we manage to replicate the outstanding success of open source in the context of AI. What's bad is if we miss the opportunity, right? Because they basically poison the antidote, right? And what's worse is if we manage to break open source in the process. And we're on track to break not only open source AI and miss that opportunity, but also potentially through trying to harmonize these two conflicting definitions, break open source itself.
How are we on track to break it?
Well, look at
overall.
VLC, for example. Like VLC, I'm a bit stealing from my talk here. VLC now, we've got two definitions from the same organization, which one of which says it's open source, and the other one says it's not, right? So I go to VLC at FOSDEM and I say, you guys open source? They're like, yeah, GPL v2. But then I'm like, well, the OSI is running around saying that the Whisper, which you've incorporated for AI subtitling in real time, is definitely not open source AI. And more software is being written by and incorporating AI. So what is it? Like, it's like Schrodinger's open source.
Right. Can I just add something I'm sort of telling tales out of school here, which I probably shouldn't be, but I'm going to. So on the day that DeepSeek moved its license or was publicly shown to be on MIT, I think it's that day, there's a post from Stefano at the OSI that says DeepSeek is not open source, and then he changes it to say it has an MIT license. What's the other chap called, the policy guy, the European
Well,
policy
it's an open weight definition. They're open weight, so it's an open weight
What's
definition.
what's the policy chap called? His name begins with J. I'm not good with names at the OSI.
Jordan,
right. So the same day, he posted that is not open source, and here's why. So you have two people employed by the organisation that's creating the definition, and they can't even decide between them, despite being the safeguard and the steward of the definition, which bits are open source. So how is anybody else meant to understand it?
Stephen?
Hi there, Stephen Von Nichols, journalist, been at this for much too long. Actually, the OSI is painfully aware of that problem. They're coming at it from a different angle. I think they need to consider the data much more so than they have. But the OSI definition that they've come up now is version 1.0. I myself would call it a beta, and it needs a lot more work, and they're aware of it. And so, I think they did the best they could under the situation, but...
I'm going to push back on you in that took 3 years, 2.5 to 3 years to get that beta out. So you can't have 2.5 to 3 years between that and the next iteration. If you want to do this in this space,
we took a decade to get it right. We took a decade to get it right the first time around. 2 to 3 years in a rapidly evolving space is speedy.
I think that's a very different scenario, because when you were looking, you've already used copyright and licensing, it was straightforward, you knew where you were going, it was very established, and the pace wasn't anything like the pace now. So we will not be looking at the same AI, and it's why fundamentally I think trying to define it is a highway to nothing. I think the right approach is to understand that the missing piece in this jigsaw, and you might want to define open weights, fair enough, but I think the missing piece is really the data understanding.
But why does this all matter to the people in the room? What is it that really is at stake for like a software engineer or a data engineer?
You have to know if you can use the software, right? Currently, as a developer, I can reach for open source software and use it. And as a lawyer, I can check if the software has a certain license and use it. And if not, if we don't have this very clear, simple, easy to apply, and critically able to be applied by yourself, right, by the developer and by the user. Because currently we're seeing the situation that Amanda's referring to, where we don't even know how to apply the OSA ID, and we're kind of waiting for the OSI apply it themselves, whereas we've got the safety of this level of indirection of 96-something licenses, where you can self-apply the open source definition. That's not true anymore. That's dangerous.
We have a question.
Yeah, it's kind of playing into this a little bit, but in the early days of open source, I'd say 15, 20 years ago, I was trying to sell open source to enterprises and governments, and often it was almost impossible to do that because they were worried about the FUD from the breaking patents of Linux that at the time Bulmer and Microsoft had kind of propagated, and then the other issue was around liability and the ownership of the code and so on. I feel like there's maybe parallels with the data and like the liability and it's quite murky. Do you feel like we might get to a point where there's so much FUD around the data and the training of the AI that it becomes difficult for enterprises or organizations to actually use these models? And do we end up in a world where we have the equivalent of what I was facing, which was the patent trolls and all the protection that we needed against maybe some kind of data trolling? Or do you think that that's not going to happen in this case?
Can I say something on this? So 15, 20 years ago when he was doing that, I was the lawyer in the company he was doing it in, and we worked very closely together back then. And what you're looking at now is a completely different environment, but you have the same problem with FUD. And for me, there's two things here. The first is that you have the ability of big companies to indemnify the risk and stand behind it from an insurance perspective. And they can do that because they self-insure. They don't go to the markets and buy insurance. So anybody who wants to do a commercial deal to compete with them has to be able to take liability and can't because they can't buy the insurance. So that comes down to the FUD and the fear and not knowing what the risk is. And then when you also, when you look at this and you look at why people weren't buying it before and what they'll buy now, it's not just about an indemnity, it's about what are you indemnifying against? So what are you safeguarding your customers against? And what you're talking about is legal risk, right? And that legal risk comes back to the meaning of the words. And you see something like the EU's AI Act, which uses this free and open source AI term, and it means nothing, right? They don't even know that open source doesn't have a hyphen. They have no idea what they're talking about. They've stuck this term in. Sorry, that's a bit, I'm very tired, it's the end of the conference. They've stuck this thing in there without actually understanding what it means, but it lets you off the hook. So if I'm Meta and I go along and say I'm open source, does that mean I don't have these liabilities? So it really matters to get this detail right, because there's going to be a lot of money at stake on it, and it's going to be a way that you're able to confuse markets and close down competition, close down commercialization.
Any questions?
You disagree? You look like you disagree with me. Go on,
No,
disagree with
no.
me.
I mean, I think I mostly agree, but I also, oh boy, there's so many different ways we could go. I mean, I think the one thing that I wish, if you could run back the clock, even just 6 months or 12 months, whatever, the AI Act, putting that defined term in there, was a real spanner in the works for everybody, right? Because putting that, I mean, I was telling somebody yesterday, right? Like, we had never had open source in any significant legislation in the U.S. or the EU. That term.
The EU has, but not that term.
Well, but not until like 2 or 3 years ago,
Yeah.
right? And then, and so it took us, 20 some years to get there in open source software, and it took us 20 some months to get there in AI, and that was I think the EU got way out over its skis there, and sort of put the rest of us in a bind where if we don't move, like, my understanding is that Zuckerberg from the very top, right? Like, this is not something his people have invented. Like, he from the very top has told them, this is open source now.
Yeah.
You're going to go out and you're going to tell Brussels that is the thing.
Yeah.
And like, that leaves, so like, we can't take our time, right?
I believe
which
from
sucks.
what I've been told also that may well be the case.
He
That
also
that's where it
said
comes from.
metaverse was the thing too, though, right?
Right,
So-
but hang on. But it's not just one company. And that's what it comes down to, is there was a lot of lobbying around the AI Act with a lot of big companies. Now, if I'm a policymaker or a regulator, I'm going to be asking myself, why are these big companies asking me to put regulation in place that they have to comply with? And they're doing it because they create regulatory capture. When we launched our first report, we did it with Meta, and we did it with Jimmy Wales in July 23. I think it was a week before Llama 2 was coming out. We knew it was coming out, and I'd read the license. And we were sitting in the room, and Jimmy said there are 8 companies in the world that can comply with this legislation. So it's not surprising that those companies were asking for that, because effectively they're foreclosing a market.
Anyone have a question there? There's one in the back.
Yeah, so in that I mean that they may move on as quickly as they did for metaverse, and they could actually be doing us a favour. It could be a net positive, like wrapping the New York Times in open source AI is the greatest thing ever.
I mean, the thing is that if they want to run around saying metaverse is the greatest thing ever, I mean, one, they're still
But they're not anymore.
they're still pouring billions of dollars a year into it.
Yeah.
Right. It's not the top headline
Right.
because it's stupid, but it's like, but they're still pouring billions of dollars a year into it. But critically, also, like, that's not a term we're fighting over, right? Like, nobody else is like, no,
Not
actually,
today.
metaverse means this other thing, right? Whereas, like, as you pointed out, I mean, I think the biggest. I mean, I loudly want to second what you said about we risk really confusing the original brand with all this, right? Like, and that's a thing. But the thing where, again, I have some empathy for where the OSI is at is that they didn't have the luxury of waiting because both the EU and Facebook in boots on the ground in Brussels, right? Like they are lobbying the EU
I don't
to
agree.
use
Hang
their
on, that's not
definition.
right. But
We're gonna
that's
get to the
not
question.
right. They started
Amanda,
it before then.
let's get to the question.
They started before that.
Hi, everyone. My question to the panel is, I'm understanding that the main point of contention is the openness of the training model of whether or not we can call the model open if there's not the training data also involved. In that case, is there other ways of revealing the state of the training data set, like a data nutrition label, if you will, of that reveals what type of data it is? I mean, we moved away from the discussion, but that was a point earlier in the conversation.
Nutrition labels work because of regulators, right? If you've got a nutrition label that says it doesn't have nuts in it, there's nuts in it, then the regulators are going to deal with it. So you have to trust the vendors then to put in what they say they're putting in.
There's a really fundamental, basic, simple problem with open source, which is when the OSI set the OSI up, Bruce was given bad legal advice, in my view, and he was told not to register the trademark. So he doesn't have a right to go and enforce it. And if we had that, it's the fundamental problem. So everybody should learn about trademarks from this. But it's a fundamental problem that they can't enforce that. They have no teeth to go and challenge. And if we, that one little mistake is really the problem.
We have time for one more question. Is there anyone?
I actually would like to just add one more point of elaboration on this question, right? Because I think it's actually really important that we have to start figuring out when we say open, what are the values that we as a society want to get out of that, right? It's not just users. Because there are some things that we cannot do traditional open around, right? Like medical data sets, scanned books more recent than 1927, whatever. Like there's a lot of stuff that we want to get some of those societal values out of, but we can't do open we just literally can't do open in the traditional way around them. How do we distill some of these values that we wanted out of traditional open and figure out other ways to get at them that aren't copyright licenses, right? That get to this governance question, get to the regulatory question. Yeah. But that's going to require us to talk about values, which open source has been very we haven't wanted to talk about that.
I don't know if it does require the values piece. I think it requires deep understanding of what the rights are and the use cases, and then there's a practical approach to it. And
but you have to know to what end you're using those rights. Because some people are going to say...
But that's not about values, that's about legality.
No, the systems are intertwined here when you're talking about because legally I can say, we'll just stop using things before, printed after 1927.
So I'm a bit more of an originalist. I don't want to change the meaning of open source, right? I want to apply it to a new domain without adding patents or ethics or some other things that are
but you can't, right? Because you can't answer the questions like, what do we do with medical data? Like you can't answer that question.
You can if you disaggregate the pieces and you keep the term open source to apply to open source, to apply to software, and then you look at the different component parts and you talk about data governance.
We got a question in the back. Okay.
But they have that whole, what is it called at the ODI, Gavin? The data...
Data spectrum.
Thank you.
Do you know the time we have?
You've got 5 minutes.
Less than 5 minutes?
Yeah.
Yeah,
you're next door, Gavin, I think.
I've got a direct example of...
Are you in the data room? Because I think you're next door. No. So that's solved a lot of problems.
Just-in-time conferencing.
Yeah.
I guess my question is more for the longer term too. If we keep going down this path that we're going on, it's hard to understand. Even if it's hard to understand what the impacts are going to be on future deployments and future management of these entire systems. without some understanding of the black boxes themselves, of the training data themselves. What are those longer term implications that we face, that impact both not just the software development, but the infrastructure, itself as well?
I think a lot depends on whether we end up standardizing. I think an undertold story, to what you were saying earlier about like, there's a list of licenses. We look at it, it's pretty easy to tell. That's at least as important as the specifics of what we standardized around. So I think if we standardize on a few things, we'll get some of the values that you're talking about in terms of deployment. If we don't standardize, if we have 10,000 different combinations of licenses and governance or whatever, that's really going to...
Well, this is where the cost factor comes in. I'm curious from your perspective, Sam, because, it seems like, memories of, 30 years ago where, big enterprise legacy systems were built, basically they hired as many engineers as they could. You see that today with these larger companies doing kind of similar kind of thing. But the infrastructure gets old. It doesn't really stand up to time, and and here we are with really bloated, terrible enterprise software.
Yeah, I mean, look, all of the talk about the cost, and this is one of the excuses we got for rushing it out in October, was that it's so expensive to do this stuff and so on.
Yeah.
But in the same week, last week, we had the US going, we're going to spend $500 billion, and then from the other side of the world, we heard it was 5 million, right? So people have got the money. They spent 500 million in Germany trying to build an LLM that was limited success. They've spent however much they spent on Lucy, who we saw this morning, in the probably several $1 million range.
But what will the impact be with openness and transparency really infused, into the, into the whole southward, into the development life cycle of AI systems and services?
The impact on what? The impact on innovation?
On cost.
On cost. Well, it's going to bring costs down, right? It's bound to bring costs down because we were talking earlier about distillation and the ability to recycle and reuse, and you get back to those old basic principles of open source being applied in that AI context, and they drive the price down. And it's something that outside of the US, we've really been advocating for, because if the rest of the world wants to be part of that innovation story, we have to have access to those technologies. And only right now, the US and China have those. And, you can spend 80 million, or what was it the Commission were putting in, 4 billion. I think the Commission said that they were going to spend 4 billion, and that was what Meta had already spent to date. You're just never going to compete with it. So the only way we have any chance of being in the AI future is to open it up.
Right, yeah, it seems like it's still a very select few who can actually build it and develop it and deploy it and manage it.
Well, the flip side of cost is value, of course, which goes to the 9 or whatever business models. We have to work those business models out. The thing that worries me about Meta's Llama, for example, is what's the business model? Why is it so important to diffuse it? Right, the most obvious business model, if you're not offering it as a service, and I don't think they'll do that because of Workspace, but I believe the technical term is enshittification through advertising.
Right. Well, thank you very much, everyone. I really appreciate this. Thank you, everyone, for being here, and we'll see what happens. Thanks a lot.